For the last 12 years, I've been a board member of the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, and about 3 years ago, we invented 6 degrees, which you're about to participate in. So thank you for being a part of this. It's been a great pleasure for us to be guests here at the symposium, which you've been doing for 50 years. We hope one day to be celebrating our 48th year, as you have done, of 6 degrees. You'll see it's a bit different. As you can see, the structure is a little different. And what we decided to do when we created 6 degrees was to do away with a sense that so many people had started to introduce into discourse, which was this kind of false dichotomy debate by creating two sides, the bad people and the good people, creating a debate where people would yell at each other and then think that we'd done something positive for, social justice. And instead, we've done this. We created a circle. We weren't the first. We borrowed the circle idea. And what we've created in 6 degrees, I think you'll see, is a kind of a 3D chess version of a TED Talk. So you're involved. It's not the one to many, it's many to many. The conversation will start here in the middle of the circle, and it'll be expected to spiral out to you. We look forward to your participation, your active participation, your active interventions, and then it'll come back to the circle. So we hope to explore the idea that certain issues actually have more than two sides. They are complex, they are significant, and we want to sort of get at the heart of the question today of inclusion and diversity. As we say at the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, diversity is in fact a reality. It is inclusion that takes work and attention, and so that's what we're going to talk about today. Action will happen in this way. We'll start the morning with a few introductions, and then there will be a breakout session from here to downstairs. You'll get to choose whether to stay here or to move downstairs to the coffee house portion of the morning. And then we'll have 2 360 sessions, one here this morning, then we'll have lunch, and then we'll have one here this afternoon after lunch, and then we'll have a conclusion session. Before we get started, I'm going to invite to the stage for a few words of introduction the chair of ABB and, of course, the chair of the St. Gallen Foundation for National Studies, Peter Voser.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming and adding another day to the symposium time. Now, those who were with us yesterday, I'm not Jeremy Rifkin, so you can stay seated, you can take pictures, you can use your iPhones and tape everything. I don't care, because this is about talking to each other, talking about what is important for society in the longer term. And if it's important for society, for citizenship, it is also important where I still spend a lot of time, and that's the business. Because if we can't actually manage inclusion and diversity, we will not be successful in the business. It is a proven case that you can only succeed if you can manage those two issues in business as well. So, thank you very much for being here. I look forward to a very open dialogue. I have to say this is very familiar territory for me. I have done this also in one of my old companies at Shell, because this is one of the best ways to engage with the room, and don't be shy. I had the system at Shell, you could even grab the chair and join if you really want to make a strong point. I think today we leave you down there and you just talk to us. But it's a great honor to have our Canadian friends here. So thank you very much for choosing St. Gallen and also the symposium as your partner. And we look forward to a great day today, and hopefully also going forward some very good and excellent collaboration. So with that, enjoy the day. It's not about us, it's about you. And that's where inclusion also starts. Thank you very much, and I look forward to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Now I want to invite to this stage the co-chairs of the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, the Right Honourable Adrienne Clarkson and John Ralston Sull.
Well, thank you very much. I can't think of a more wonderful setting, and being a lovely day, we can actually see the hills, which is really very nice. Otherwise, I can imagine we'd be like inside a milkshake, and it's quite wonderful to be here. I just wanted to give you a little background on the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, which is the umbrella organization for 6 Degrees. I was Governor General of Canada for 6 years. There's no fixed mandate to be Governor General. You sort of stay on and on until somebody says, you know, maybe it's time now that we have somebody else. It's very Anglo-Saxon, actually. And it's not fixed, there's no rules, etc. Generally, people stay for about 4 to 5 years, and I was asked to stay for 6. And at the end of it, I wanted to have a legacy which would reflect what I reflected to the Canadian people, and for which I believe I was nominated, which is that I was somebody who came to the country with absolutely nothing and became Governor General of Canada. And that's the story of my life and the story of what you can be in Canada and what I represent. So the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, I started with my husband, John Ralston Saul, because it meant that you can become a Canadian citizen within 3 to 5 years in Canada, and then from then on you can go wherever you want to go, right to the top. And this organization, our foundation, was to do that. We started out with very practical programs, one of which was special ceremonies for citizenship. We have wonderful ceremonies for citizenship, 2,900 of them a year across the country, because we welcome about 280,000 new citizens every year. But we wanted to do special ones with round tables where new citizens would get a chance to interchange with established citizens, members of the Order of Canada, people who were already very established in the country. And so we do those special ceremonies all across the country. They're volunteer, organized, based, and they're in small communities like Sudbury, Northern Ontario, or they're in big cities like Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Calgary. The other thing that we did, which was very important, and I want to tell you about that, take a little time to do that, was a cultural access pass. When I was a child, I thought being taken to museums was great, and my parents didn't have time to do that. They were working so hard. And the schools had programs where little children are taken to the museums. And I thought, what about the parents who are working on assembly lines in offices, don't have the time to go? I wanted all people to have access to all the cultural institutions we have, all the museums, all the public parks, the national parks, which, as you may know, in Canada are huge, like Banff National Park has all the Rockies in it, Waterton National Park, plus our smaller ones where you go camping on weekends, etc. So we developed something called the Cultural Access Pass in partnership with these cultural institutions, all of whom receive, of course, as yours do, grants from government. All our landed immigrants who are preparing to be citizens have been paying taxes ever since they came and had jobs, so they actually have ownership in it because all the cultural institutions have ownership. And so I said, why don't we have 1 year for free for every new Canadian citizen and their family of up to 4 children to any cultural institution in Canada. So we have 1,500 institutions which welcome from sea to sea Canadians, new Canadians and their families. And also with that cultural access pass, they are able to access 50% reduction on the lowest advertised fare on the railway for 1 year. That gets them in touch with the country, with nature, etc. Those were practical programs, and they were enormously successful. We continue them. We are now digitizing our CAP pass so it'll be more easy to access for people. We hope to capture 98% of new Canadian citizens in a few years. And in this, of course, we work in close partnership with government and the Ministry of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship. That's the ministry that takes care of all of that. So that was what we have as a base. And then we said after 9-10 years, we're ready to launch out into something that is going to be a thought provoker, that's going to be a thing that's going to gather people all around, not only Canada, but probably in the world, to talk about citizenship and belonging. And that's when we started 6 Degrees. And John Ralston Saul will tell you about that.
So just very, very quickly, we always knew that our idea was you should start out by putting in place grassroots programming so we really had a sense of what was happening across the country and what the relationships were between immigrant New Canadians and the country. But we always knew that we had to go much further. We had to do something far more intellectual, far more public, far more engaged. And so we gradually came up with this idea of 6 degrees. And as we moved towards launching it about 2 years ago, of course, this atmosphere of fear was growing all around the world. This fear of the other, of inclusion, of crisis, and not just on the Mediterranean, all over the world, of racism, return of appalling racism, really all around the world. And so we launched 6 degrees in the middle of all of that. And it really is, if you ask, what is this really about? Well, it's really about working with people like you, trying to come up with the language, the way to talk about immigration, refugees, citizenship, diversity, belonging, a way which is not influenced by fear, and to create a kind of a language, a discourse that can be used in countries all around the world, not a Canadian discourse, an international discourse, that we can all take home, that we all learn from each other, and that we can kind of engage in this debate which is going on and reformulate the debate. One of the reasons that the self-evident positive nature of immigration is treated as a negative is because the people who are the humanists, the people who are not afraid, have lost the public argument. We don't have the language, we don't have the way to debate, and the populists and the racists have dominated the argument. So this 6 degrees is all about creating a language, the language of the inclusive people, the language of the people who aren't afraid, the language of the people who believe in inclusion. And from that, actions can be imagined, and from that, actions can be taken. And just I would add one last sentence, which Marty quite rightly said, we borrowed the concept of the circle as a way of doing this, and of course there are many circles in the history of the world, but as Canadians, we were deeply influenced by the Indigenous approach towards things which is deeply non-linear and deeply spatial and circular. And so we owe a great debt of gratitude for the source of that idea within our own territory. And it has other applications elsewhere in the world. So have a wonderful day.
John quite rightly pointed out that we borrowed the circle from... I'll say one more thing, which is John wants to say something.
Yeah, one more thing, which is I didn't say, and Adrienne didn't say, thank you to Peter, thank you to St-Gallen. We're thrilled to be partnering with you. It's very, very exciting for us. It's the second non-Canadian 6 degrees, and we're getting a strategy together, and so it's wonderful to have a partner like St-Gallen.
Thank you. We borrowed this circle concept from the Indigenous, but also, as John alluded to, there are other notions, which is that the Indigenous in Canada have an oral tradition, and so storytelling is very significant. And in fact, one of the ways that we're avoiding falling prey to the challenge of the false dichotomy is to rely on storytelling. So we're going to start this morning session with some stories about newcomers, which will take place here. So those of you who want to stay and participate and share and hear the stories of newcomers, this will be taking place here for the next 60 minutes. And for those of you who want to participate in the cut and thrust of discussion, that will be taking place in a coffee house setting in the room immediately below us on the main floor, on the lower floor of this building. So I'm going to invite you now to divide yourselves up into either staying in this session or moving downstairs to the coffee house session, and 60 minutes from now, we'll all meet back up here for the first 360. Thank you.
Canada, we all have our different stories. And we've got two people here who are very close to the Institute. Upkar Arora is one of our country's outstanding chartered public accountants, a very respected profession. And we are very fortunate that he is on our board and has been for some time, and brings a very elegant and interesting perspective to our deliberations and our attempts to do what we can for Canadian citizenship in Canada. And Zabeen Hirji, is recently retired vice president of the bank, the Toronto Dominion Bank.
RBC.
The RBC, Royal Bank of Canada, the Royal Bank of Canada. We only have 5, so it's easy to confuse them. And the Royal Bank of Canada, and has been responsible for their diversity programs, has been much lauded and praised, and has gone on to continue to do very interesting things. And she's now the chair of something called Civic Action, which she will tell you about, which is a very important movement in Toronto. But each of us grew up in different ways in Canada, and each of us come from an immigrant background. And you heard a bit about my story yesterday if you were there, so I want to begin actually with Zabene's, because hers is not only her individual story, but it's a story of a particular group, and this is something that happens in Canada from time to time. Zabeen.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here for the symposium and for today, and certainly one of the things that I love to do is to be amongst younger people, because the energy that comes from it is really quite palpable for me, and I certainly go away always, and I know this will be the same, energized and inspired to do more. So thanks for the opportunity. So my story started in 1960 when I was born in Tanzania in East Africa. I was born the daughter of parents who were one who was born in Tanzania, one who was born in Uganda, and my grandparents emigrated from India to East Africa, and they were in search of a better life for themselves and for their children that they didn't have at the time, but for their future children. And essentially, my grandfather hopped on a ship and didn't even know where in East Africa it was going to land. There was opportunity, and he just the entrepreneurial spirit of immigrants is certainly one of the themes. Hopped on and landed in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam, and then went inland to a small town called Moshi, where he settled. He came with no material possessions. Within, we don't have a lot of time, so I have to make this short, but within probably about, so this would have been around 1910, we don't know exactly when, but it would have been around that time. And within about 2 decades, really had become a very successful entrepreneur and built up many businesses which continued to build and flourish. And eventually his children took over the business, my father being one of those 4 of the sons. My grandparents had 10 children. And then the business continued to grow. In the late 60s, Tanzania's political ideology changed, and one of the things that happened as a result of that is many of the private industry was expropriated. And so my family lost a lot of their businesses and a lot of their wealth. And while they could have continued to live there for that generation, my parents decided that they wanted opportunity, just as their parents had decided for their children, and decided to move to Canada. So fast forward now, 1974, and that's when I arrived in Canada with one small change to my personal situation. My father, unfortunately, passed away in a car accident at the age of 43 before we moved to Canada. And so my mother brought her 2 teenage children, 14 and 18, to this very far away land, but with the same drive, ambition, resilience, risk-taking, many of the characteristics that immigrants possess. And we landed in Vancouver, which has a slightly milder climate, which is why we went there, and started all over again. And so, certainly one of the themes there is being the daughter of a very strong woman.
And what did you do as a job?
So I arrived at 14, and I went to school. So I went to high school and did a number of part-time jobs while I was at school. And that was an important element for me of integration, of this really, the sense of belonging comes from going to school, from being in a work environment, and having some of the financial freedom that came from that. So 3 years later, as I graduated from high school, I was 17, and I decided to take a gap year, which some of you would be familiar with, before going to university, and I joined the Royal Bank of Canada. When I joined the bank, there were the workforce was about 70% female. There were no women executives in 1977. The first one was appointed in 1978. And there were no minority executives. In fact, there were very few branch managers who were women or minorities. And I was going to work for a year and then go to university full time. Long story short, I decided to stay on at the bank and go to university part-time. So it was it was a much longer time that it took me, and I went to Simon Fraser University on the West Coast, where I have an MBA from, and made that decision to stay at the bank. And it was partly also going to be a lot easier for my mother. To not have the financial obligation or responsibility to put me through school. What I should really say, one story that I think has been really important, and these formative experiences, I think the message here is how important these formative experiences in your life are. And so how we support and include people very early on is really key to, I think, also what we become. So one of the experiences my mother had was this vicious cycle of no Canadian experience, no job. So she was part of the gig economy, not by choice. She worked for a placement agency, and she would go from, a few days here to a few days there. And while she never spoke about it to us because she didn't want to burden her children, I could see it. I could see it in her expression. I could see it in the way she spoke, how difficult it was for her, who she was a semi-skilled worker. She was a secretary, or skilled, I suppose you could say. She was trained in London, UK, so that was really not the issue. But the fact that she didn't have Canadian experience and she didn't look like everyone else really meant that finding work was very difficult. And that really is one of the reasons that I have probably been so active in this space. So I stayed at RBC, and I was fortunate that I did join an organization that, while we didn't have women executives, really believed in in people's potential. And so very quickly, within a couple of years, I went on to the management training program. I was a branch manager at the age of 21. I have many stories of clients, walking up to a male colleague or somebody and saying, would say, "Oh, I don't want to deal with her." When he'd say, "Oh, well, you need to talk to her," and he'd say, "Well, she's my manager." Oh, okay. So, there's lots of sort of little experiences there, but I then continued my career at the bank, where I spent about 20 years on the business side. There were certainly barriers, challenges along the way that one has to overcome. So it's not Canada is not a perfect land, but certainly the belief in people's potential, that everybody comes with a lot of potential, and what do you do as an organization, as a society, as a civil society, to really help bring that out in people. So 20 years on the business side, retail banking, credit cards, operations, technology, strategy. And then just as my career had gone before, I went into human resources, really with the view that this would be another rotation for me, and that I would go, I would go back into a different role. Very quickly, though, and this is where certainly I think what's maybe different to some extent with this generation, I have two millennial kids, 22 and 24. So I get lots of lessons on how to engage with youth and at home. But I realized when I very shortly after being in HR that I had in fact found the place not where that I loved what I did, but I actually did what I loved. And there is a difference there to be in a place where I could really play a significant role in helping people in the organization, in creating the policies, the culture, the enablers for everybody to have equal opportunity to achieve their full potential. And to really create the mindset within the organization that this is a win-win strategy. This is not just about helping people achieve and realize their ambitions. This is about the organization being successful. This is about the organization, when you get the best out of everyone, then clearly, I mean, the math is pretty clear there, but it's something that I found was my calling in many ways, and so stayed in human resources. And interestingly, I had quite a bit of pressure to go back to a business role. I had business leaders say to me, well, don't you want a real job again? I felt my job was really quite real, but those are choices you make in your career, in your professional lives around what is it that I really want to do, where do I want to make the difference. So I was 10 years in HR in a number of different roles, then took on the role of Chief Human Resources Officer at RBC, which for those of you that may not be familiar with it, it is the largest Canadian bank. It's top 10 globally, 80,000 people, 40 countries, actually the largest company on the Toronto Stock Exchange. So it really is a very preeminent organization where I went from teller to C-suite, and it's a story that I have actually had a lot of difficulty. It's hard for me to tell the story, but I think the learning for me, and I remember my son was about 15 and was having this conversation with him around, I don't like telling the stories. I don't like because people, even the media, they like the human story. So there'd be an interview on something to do with the bank, and all of a sudden it became a story about me. And my son said to me, he looked at me and he said, Mama, this is no longer about you. Your story is about other people, about women, about minorities, about other people seeing what's possible. And when you can see the possibility, when that is magic, that is when you really unleash your own confidence, your drive, your potential really just flourishes, because you say, I can be anything I want to be. And that is really what inclusion is about.
That is, your personal story is really fascinating, but I do want to add for people here that Zabeen is part of a group that we received in the 1970s called the Ismailis, who are the followers of His Highness the Aga Khan, who is the only living hereditary imam of the Islamic faith. He's a Shia. And that this group of people who were so endangered in Uganda, they were killed, they had their citizenships taken away in places in the other East African countries. She's underestimated by talking nicely like that, about the danger these people were in. And at that point, the Aga Khan said to the Prime Minister of Canada, who was then Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the present Prime Minister's father, will you in Canada take 10,000 Ismailis in? At the time, in Canada, I've looked this up, there were 800 Muslims in all of Canada. And so we said, we take, and we did. And Trudeau said, yes, we will. And so we have this influx of Ismailis who, because of what they believe, have brought enormous wealth, for one thing, but also knowledge, community feeling to our country. And it's part of waves of people that we have taken when we didn't have any others like them. For instance, the Vietnamese boat people in the 70s who were all from Vietnam, and we didn't have any Vietnamese in Canada. We had some Chinese leftovers from the railway times and new immigrants who were slowly starting to come from the mainland or from Hong Kong to university, etc. But we didn't have people like that, and we just took this big lump of them, and they have all done very well, really exceptionally well. So that's, Upkar's different in a way. He's another kind of immigration story.
Thanks, Adrienne. And first of all, thanks, Peter. Thanks, Beat. Thanks, Ralph, who I met last fall, Shaun Rudolph. And it's just been such a pleasure to be here and learn and be inspired by the people here and the speakers you've had. So really appreciate the opportunity. So my story starts in a similar time frame to Zabene's. I was born in India about 55 years ago, and we moved away from India when I was 2 years old to England. My dad was looking for a better job, a better life, a better education, and so he went to England, and he started to get his CA with a firm that Zabene's doing some work now called Deloitte, Planters and Griffiths. And so while we were in England, the Canadian government was actually looking for CAs, and they didn't have any in Canada, so they actually went over to England and recruited and offered my dad a job. And they said you can work in one of 3 cities in Canada. There's where they had tax centres in Canada. They're Sudbury, Winnipeg, or London. Since London was the only name he had heard, he picked London. And lo and behold, as an 8-year-old, I moved over to London, Ontario, Canada. I was in for a bit of a treat with respect to the amount of snow, but let me give you a sense of London at that time.
What year would this have been?
1970.
1970, okay.
So London at that time was considered a very, what they call a WASP community, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and to sort of put that into perspective, in my public school class there was 30 people and 1 person of color, that was me. And in my high school, there were 2,600 students and 4 visible minorities, of which I was one of 4. So it gives you a sense of the community. So needless to say, while we have, I think, done amazing things since then, but if you ask me, was there a level of discrimination or racism or bigotry, the answer would be absolutely yes. We moved into a country that hadn't seen people like us, didn't know anything about the religion, the customs, the practices. In fact, I recall as a child being very ashamed of having a very hard time fitting in. But bringing friends over in case they saw what we ate and what we did and how we worshipped and all those other things. It was very, very difficult to fit in. And so it was a very, very tough childhood growing up. And yet, you know what the issue was? We actually had it easy. We had it easy because of a number of things. One is we spoke English, or at least we thought we did until we got to Canada and realized that the English of England is different from that in Canada. My dad was educated, so was my mom, and my dad had a job when he arrived. So we had all these advantages, and yet even then, trying to fit in and managing that internal conflict between expectations of a new community about fitting in, at the same time preserving the idealism of many immigrant families of preserving their heritage, their culture, their identity, was really, really problematic. So, you know, when I entered the work world, what I found was, ironically, the people I ended up working with were also, in some ways, like me, immigrants like me. And it's the story of Canada, as Adrienne has said repeatedly. So one of my most important jobs was working with someone named Paul Rifkin, who himself came to Canada in 1956 from Budapest as a Jewish immigrant. And Paul Rifkin, through a number of years, the name you might recognize, has left his indelible imprint on the world's skylines. First building the tallest building in the Commonwealth at the time in 1972 in Toronto called First Canadian Place, then turning and transforming a garbage dump in New York called Battery Park into what is now World Financial Center, and then more recently, now looking to east of London at these derelict docklands and seeing that there was just incredible degradation, and it was really a result of what we've talked about for the past 3 days, which is technology had replaced dock workers no longer being used as a port, and they had fallen into a state of disarray. So he decided to build what is now a thriving financial center called Canary Wharf. I think it's 175,000 people that work there in London now. And so I joined Paul and worked with Paul for about 6 years in these areas. And from there, I worked with another Jewish immigrant, Peter Monk. And Peter Monk, for those of you who come from, Peter would know this, who come from a business background, Peter Monk identified the need for people to invest in institutional quality public gold companies outside of South Africa and created what was the biggest gold company in the world called Barrick Gold. And from there, Jerry Schwartz, who runs the most preeminent private equity fund. And ultimately, I took the benefit of the learnings from those three business leaders and others working at Nortel Networks and KPMG and others, and for my own company, which was really advising, buying, selling, building, growing, and ultimately helping companies succeed in their various roles. You know, outside of the professional world, I was really fortunate. I took on the role as a chair of a gallery that Adrienne and Zabeen would know called the McMichael Canadian Art Collection. And why it's relevant to Adrienne's comments yesterday. It's really the art gallery that houses what we call the most iconic painters of Canada, the group of 7. And so I became the chair of that gallery. First time in its 46-year history that someone of a non-white background to take on that role. Being on the board of Metrolinx. Metrolinx touches on the topic yesterday. We talked about mobility. It's a regional transportation authority, and we've got the mandate of spending $40 billion over the next 10 years to transform the Toronto area for the 6.9 million residents, soon to grow to 10 million residents, to improve the quality of life through better infrastructure and transportation and bringing in some mobility as a service. And then really what has been really inspiring, as Zabeen said, being able to actually teach at my school, creating a course that's called Success Beyond the Classroom, which was really thought of by me and created by me. And it really relates to exactly what we've talked about over the past 3 days, which is non-technical content, trying to instill in students an awareness of those skills that are so important in the world that they'll enter into, a rapidly changing world full of technological change, things like critical thinking, problem solving, communication, analysis, synthesis, teamwork, collaboration, and having the opportunity to teach students in that area. And then, of course, being involved with Adrienne and John at the ICC has been an incredible blessing as well. You know, I look at those experiences, both work and outside of work, and I say, and I sort of wish I could say that all of those, quote, so-called successes were really due to me. And the real answer is they were not. Canada, maybe my father first, but Canada provided me with the opportunity. They knocked on the door. All I did was merely answer that. I wish I could say it was because of my unique talents or gifts. It really wasn't. Maybe I had a propensity to work hard, a little bit of talent, a passion, a desire to become independent and successful. And as Zabeen has mentioned, building up a bit of resilience as a result of the changes that I went through and the challenges growing up as a child. So, you know, if I step back and look at the question that Adrienne's asked about this session and so forth, it's really, was it worth it? Was immigration and then citizenship for me, was it worth it? Well, I think the answer is actually not going to be measured by what's in my bank account and my success at the end of the day. You know, the way I look at it is it's measured in part by the business students that I'm fortunate enough to teach and guide and try to reframe their perspective of how they see their world, how they see their role in the world, and how to adapt and have meaningful careers and lives as a result. I look at it, it's embedded in my daughter's desire, her commitment to improving the lives of mothers and children as she finishes off her medical school in the next couple of years. And it's also reflected in my son, his sense of belonging. You know, my son's been to 29 different countries at the age of 21. He's leaving in a couple of days to spend 3 months in Zambia with Engineers Without Borders. And despite that, no matter where we go and where we travel, when he comes back, he always says, "It is good to be home." It's also reflected in the, in the pride of my 85-year-old father. A few months ago, so he made the fateful decision and took the risk to come to Canada. And as he watched me cross the stage to get what's called the FCPA, which is the highest distinction awarded to chartered accountants in the country, and reflected on that. I'm sure he thought that his decision was the right one, to see his kids succeed. So, you know, am I naive enough to think that this is the story of every single person that comes to Canada? That every person comes with this desire and commitment to succeed and to better, or to embolden and better the country? I'm not. I'm not naive enough to think that. But do I believe we need to build societies that provide the environment, that create the opportunity for the overwhelming majority who, in fact, are committed to making a profound impact in their societies and in their communities? Absolutely, yes, I do. You know, sometimes I look back at that 8-year-old kid, and if someone had said, you'll have the opportunity as an 8-year-old kid coming from India, working with elite business leaders, working for world-class organizations, working with people like Adrienne and John and others, and transforming education, arts and culture, transportation and city building, citizenship, and so forth, I would not have believed that. And along the many paths that I've traveled, I've seen so many people that have overcome so much more than I have done so much more than I have done, out of conditions that have been much more deplorable or difficult than I have faced. And I admire them and I applaud them. But, you know, more importantly, I've seen many people on that cusp and have the potential to really make a contribution. And I believe it's my duty, my responsibility, my debt of gratitude to Canada to really help them and support them in whatever way I can. And to me, that means supporting the ideals that we're talking about at this session, in this forum, and through 6 Degrees and ICC. Those ideals of acceptance, of citizenship, of inclusion, of belonging, so that we can, in fact, provide equality of opportunity to people. So that like me, we move, or they move, from being an outsider to an insider, from being a recipient to a contributor, a bystander to a participant in the creation of the civic communities and societies we value, enriched by diversity, both diversity of thought, but the diversity of the lived experience that they bring to our country.
Thank you very much, Upkar. I'm not going to take very much time because I spoke yesterday about my own story and why John and I founded the ICC. And I would just say, echo really what Upkar said, which is when he came as a child of 8, he came to a town which was very white, and I did too, and Canada was very white, and Canada had a history of racism and intolerance, and in fact, total evil. I mean, we interned Japanese Canadians who had been born on Canadian territory during the Second World War. We dispossessed them. There was an enormous amount of greed and actual terror exercised against this particular group of people, and we have done it to other people. We do not rest with unbloodstained hands in Canada, but we have been capable of changing. And we have changed as we've received more and more people from countries that were not white. That actually has been one of the things of our immigration policy, because up until about 1960, there was still a law in the books which is called the Chinese Exclusion Act. And although we came in the chaos of war on a Red Cross boat, I have seen the page in the ledger of the government that lists us as a Chinese family, and I'm listed as a 10-year-old girl, a child of my parents. My brother is there too. And this Chinese Exclusion Act was enacted only in 1923 to keep Chinese out of Canada because they were considered to be undesirable yellow people. And the Japanese were considered to be fairly desirable because Canada had a separate negotiation with the Emperor of Japan, and we had Japanese come and start fishing fleets and they were allowed to own property, etc. None of which was really true for the Chinese. But that all changed within the late 50s. What I think Canada shows is that you are capable of change, and you're capable of change very quickly. You don't have to wait 3 generations. You can wait. I grew up in a town which was Ottawa, which was the capital. There wasn't a single black person in any schools that I went to. There were a lot of Jews. There were a lot of people from Europe called displaced people after the war, with no countries. Many people with tattoos on the backs of their hands that we saw. But we were not a country that was particularly welcoming. It just happened that We did it because we needed the workforce. We needed people to work on farms. That was one of the ways you could get into Canada after the war. We dropped the Chinese Exclusion Act, but that had meant that people had to pay $100 to get into Canada, which was an enormous amount of money for a Chinese peasant trying to get on a boat in the Pearl River Delta in China. And there was enormous discrimination against Chinese, enormous discrimination against Japanese. But all of this to say that kind of dissipates eventually when, and not that slowly, when there is public education and children go to school together and live through all of that, live through name calling or live through any of those kinds of things and do well. And eventually, within my lifetime, Canada has changed just an enormous amount and will continue to change. And I think that's the hope for other people. Not that Canada has any special, wonderful virtues, but that the capability of change is shown by Canada. I think questions would be fun.
I'll just let you know, there's one back there. These are cool. They are in fact microphones, and we can in fact throw them. And so what we're going to do
Carefully we throw them.
We'll throw them carefully because they're expensive microphones, but they're cool. So we'll open the floor now, and there's a question back here, but if you've got a question, put your hand up, and we'll come back up here.
Right out.
Okay.
Two over here. You have to hold it up like this.
Thank you very much for your stories, your individual stories. I actually have a migration background myself, but I don't want to talk about that. I applaud Canada and the US, for that matter, for in the 60s and 70s to be very open and inclusionary societies where people could move and, find their own dream. That's where this term, the American dream, actually comes from. What I'm wondering about is if you think that nowadays people, especially of a migration background, would have the same chance of finding their own life in Canada. The country where I'm from, Germany, our right-wing populists point to Canada when they talk about wanting a different immigration system. And Canada especially has a point system where they prefer people with a high level of education and especially with a good bank account to come to the country. And I'm not sure that nowadays people would have the same chances that you had in the 60s and 70s, because we have regressed quite a bit from that. And I'm curious about how you reconcile where Canada is nowadays with where it was 40, 50 years ago.
I think that we have our ambassador to Switzerland here with us, and she'll say, I've only been here for less than a year, but I know she's perfectly capable of contributing to this. I would say that people think, oh yes, you pick your immigrants, therefore you pick off all the best, etc. But we don't just do that. We also take enormous amounts of refugees. We have another pattern of taking people. We also have, and this is really important for all of you Europeans to understand, we have a ministry of what's called refugees, and citizenship. And that ministry has nothing to do with the police or with Homeland Security, it has to do with bringing new people to Canada under different circumstances.
Only 20,000. You only took 20,000 refugees.
No, I think it's more than that.
So we
With the Syrians, we took around 50,000.
50,000 Syrian refugees, but we have so Canada has the most aggressive. But maybe, Ambassador, you want to speak to this? Canada has the most. This is not a session about about Canada, but Canada has the most aggressive immigration policy in the OECD countries, and our population grows by almost 1% per year from immigration. So we bring about 300,000. We have a population of about 36 million people, and we bring almost 300,000 new immigrants into Canada every year.
Our goal is 1%. We never quite make it because really that's a tremendous amount of people to process. But you go to for instance, what you call our embassy in India. It's the biggest mission in New Delhi of any of the countries, because half of it is dedicated to immigration and to visas and so on, because that's where we're processing people.
But it is true that we have a point system for determining immigrants.
Yeah, we do have a point system.
Ambassador, if you want to speak to how the point system works, or is that?
Well, I know I won't speak specifically, but I'm happy to provide more information for those of you who want to have it. It's clear that we want to manage the immigration system. Sorry. Yeah.
There you go.
It's a question of balancing, right? Well, we find that in a vast country like ours, with 36 million people, we have to make sure that we have clear rules, which is what makes it clear what do you need to follow as a process in order to come to Canada. And we are dependent on immigration for our own economic growth. Our population is declining, and therefore we need immigration in order to continue to be economically wealthy. So that's why immigration for us is not only a social but an economic indicator. You're very much aware. On the refugee, we have a balanced immigration. So there is the immigration, the economic immigration, and then there is the refugee aspect, which when the Prime Minister had pledged 25,000 Syrian refugees to come in, we actually went over that amount. And what is the specific aspect for our country is that it's not just the entry point that matters, but it's the integration. And it's also very much something that came from the community itself. There was a buy-in from the community who wanted to sponsor refugees, opened their doors to them. The government had a plan to support financially for over a year, giving them $1,200 every month. Training in terms of language, providing the schools, etc. And so we can't just look at the immigration itself, but also the integration of these newcomers into Canada, which is a measure of success, I think, whether you are a refugee or a new immigrant. So yes, there's a point system because it is required in order for us to monitor that it is sustainable and it meets the needs of our economic growth, but there's also another aspect, which is very much to create a social cohesion in Canada and include the immigrants and give them the best opportunity to thrive in the country. It's not a perfect system, but it is what we're putting in place, and we're trying to improve as we go ahead and see how we can create those conditions that you were mentioning to go from being perhaps less open and tolerant towards certain aspects of immigrant population to something that becomes part of the norm and the values of Canada when we look at all sorts of people. Look at, for example, the passports. Now we have not just male and female, we also have an X box, where you have the agnostic approach of saying you can be the gender you want. Again, that's about tolerance. And so immigration is one, but I think there's a lot more that should be considered when you look at Canada in terms of a tolerant and hospitable place to come and work.
Adrienne, there are a couple of questions behind you here.
Yeah.
Can I just say one quick thing on that, which is I think something that maybe we haven't spoken about, is the role of business in integration of immigrants into the workforce. So that is a model that I think is somewhat unique, where businesses play a huge role in everything from really changing mindsets around what immigrants bring to the work. Because keep in mind, they're also a large client segment for businesses. And so when you bring immigrants into the workforce, they have empathy, they understand what it's like holistically to be an immigrant. So banking, for example, is a business of trust. And what better way to build trust when you can really connect at that level? And just a huge, I chair an organization called the Toronto Regional Immigrant Employment Council, which has one-to-one mentoring for underemployed immigrants, because there's a large, you hear those stories of, of engineers driving taxis, for example. It's a mentoring one-to-one program, business people, new immigrants, 80% success rate in people actually finding work at the level that they're qualified for, which really brings in that economic impact. But, I would say that that's a model and an approach that perhaps has some promise.
All right, we have two people, and just I know Marty is going to lay out the ground rules. These could be questions or simply interventions, your thoughts. You don't have to ask a question. We'd love to keep it to 60 seconds so we can get as many people involved as possible. We had this young man, right, and then this gentleman there. So two at least on this side, Marty. Okay, please.
Lovely input here on the stage. I'm from Austria. I will now bring one of the biggest problems we have, because I feel like I might be able to learn then from your interventions on it. So we fear that we import crime and we import violence by immigration. And we, so far we have not managed to overcome this. So we had migration influx from the Balkans after a war there, and we had an influx from both the ethnicities, or actually the 3 or 4 ethnicities that had been in war, so we're importing the violence. We fear that the same might happen now from Middle East. So do you have answers on how we can deal with that? Does it make sense to, only allow migration influx from one of the conflict parties, or did you do special reconciliation efforts from the side of the government?
Well, I would say, first of all, where are your statistics coming from in terms of crime? Are you doing it? Are there actual tables that tell you who are committing crimes and what, or is this basically you are fearsome because there are unemployed people rampaging, or what is it actually that you are afraid of there?
Work is a big problem.
Yeah.
Because once you're not in work life,
then you think they commit crimes.
It's way more challenging to reconcile.
But do you have the facts? Yeah. Do you have the facts to prove that?
Look, yes, I can show you the criminal statistics, but you're totally right. It's different to say this is due to actually importing the conflict or due to not having work. Because if you don't have work, you're more inclined to, keep with your old stories and continue the war somewhere else. So I agree, work is a very big topic. So is this a way how you're...
we do try to get people to be able to work at whatever, and we usually find in Canada that people will work at whatever. Just for your interest, the current minister, the Liberal Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, is a Somalian of origin who emigrated to Canada when he was 16 by himself, and works his way through his education, etc. And by the age of 42, he is the Minister of IRCC, and very sensitive, therefore, to all of these things. And of course, there's no question, and it's not just with what's happening now, but in Canada, Canada is a country that has had immigration for 200 years, and the Irish came and killed each other because they were Catholic and Protestant. They tried to keep each other out of things. They tried to do so. There's the importation of old values. The way in which you can overcome that in even the shortest term is by the education of children, so that when they come to a new country, they realize they don't have those old backgrounds anymore. They're in a new country with these kinds of values, and they have the comfort of being able to leave behind the old, whatever it is, triads, if they're Chinese, every country has its own. And I do believe that people change when they come to different countries and they get different settings. It's only if you say to them, well, you are Serbian and Serbians always behave like this and they always act like this, that you are going to perpetuate those kinds of feelings in them. Little children going to school, little children going into kindergarten, grade 1, etc. Maybe they are Serbian at home. Maybe they continue to speak the language and write it with their families. That's fine. We have a lot of that in Canada. But when you come and get a public education in Canada, it's different. You are educated in a different way, so you can't just say they are going to be responsible for crime. How do you know that unless you have statistics and you say, you know, they are, this is what people say all the time about, say, Italians, and we've had Italians for 5 generations in Canada, and still people say, oh, maybe it's the mafia. You know, maybe it's Grata. Oh, no, it's true. People will still always say that. The Italians suffer the most from that kind of discrimination and that kind of stereotyping. So why should you think that was any more valid than what you're talking about?
Adrienne, Marty has one there, and I'll have one over here. All right. Yes, ma'am.
No, me. Thank you very much for your stories. And my question would be maybe for you, for Zabeen, and I want to talk about gender inclusion. And it was a very interesting observation just this morning that we were all drinking coffee, and the setting of tables, even they were like where all the men are around or where all the women are gathering. It was very interesting because we actually were here to discuss inclusion, and then we were so segregated even in this morning. So my question would be, how to encourage and what are the ways to solve this gender inclusion? So it would be maybe for you, and if you have some thoughts from your perspective, it would be also very interesting to hear. Thanks.
What a great observation you made, and not uncommon. I mean, there's a lot of different things, but I think the way that I think about inclusion and the way that I really try to drive inclusion, and there's a great line that says diversity is inviting you to the party, inclusion is asking you to dance, right, or having you on the dance floor, and it really comes from there's no systemic way to change it. It's about individual behavior. And I think in organizational settings in particular, leaders play a very significant role in being very deliberate about observing that sort of thing and inviting others into the conversation. So if you think about that in a work setting, you have that happening when you may have women who have a seat at the table, but they're not actually speaking and saying as much as, they're not contributing. And so for me, it's the role of other colleagues, or certainly the leader in the group, to say, sorry, I didn't catch your name. Dina. To say, Dina, we'd like to hear what you have to say about it. There has to be that sort of deliberateness around that. The same happens, if you move it on to actually women or gender having that seat at the table. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen on its own. You would like to think that that we're at a place in society where that happens. So at an organizational level, when you look at your whole talent practices, one of the things that I am a big proponent of is that you do have to have objectives. Anything that's important in business, any business growth you want to do, you have objectives. If you want to get the best out of your talent, you need to have objectives. And so I was always a proponent and actually had in place goals around women. Canada today has a gender-balanced cabinet, and the Prime Minister decided that that's what he was going to do, because otherwise change is way too slow.
I would add to that I am of a different generation. As Margaret Atwood and I now always announce at places like this, we are old. And we are old, and therefore we are wiser. And we started out at a time when you cannot imagine how women were treated. When I went into television in 1965, you cannot imagine the sexual harassment, the denigration, the automatic assumption that you would get somebody's coffee even though you were running the show. All of that we have lived through and gone through and pierced, and all the gains that we have made have to now be completely built on. And so movements like Me Too are not a moment too soon. and have to gather up a lot from the past. But those of us who went into, who became prominent in after the second wave of feminism, which was the early 70s, we thought heaven had opened for us. We thought, women, by the time our children are 20 years old, everything will be open to them. It'll be all wonderful, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it didn't happen, and it's not going to happen without a lot of fighting back and a lot of continued push. And that is now true for the LGBTQ. It's true for all of that. And, the idea that, if you had one or two women, I had this wonderful phrase, which is colloquial English, of being the only broad on the board. I was the only broad on the board of our major trust company, which, by the way, not because of me, went bankrupt. And it was really horrifying, but it was a very interesting examination to me of how men work together. I've never written about it, but I might at some time, because I saw how men actually grouped together and protected what was not worth protecting in a huge financial institution, which suffered a lot because of that and had history, etc. And so I think we have to be really, really careful not to think that women have had it all because they now have so many places, etc. There's still an endemic thing. And of course, and we can have a feminist seminar sometimes. You'll never get over the fact that men resist. They don't know that they resist. And the reason they resist is there's a fundamental, enormous jealousy on the part of the male that it's through females that the human race continues. And that is the basic fundamental thing of the harassment, of everything that happens, is that, and this is not new to me, this was our first rallying cry in 1971. And it's a long time ago, but it's still true. And then you have to take that into consideration when you're making the other assumptions. Now we have prime ministers who are having babies. We're having people being able to bring their children into Parliament and nurse them and things like that. And that's all great, but you want to make sure that's not superficial and that it's actually, right from the start, women have an equal get-go.
Adrienne, I have about 5-6 minutes. Do you want to take a couple more and then do a wrap-up, maybe? This gentleman's been waiting a bit, and then maybe, and then so 2 more, anyways. Yes, please.
Thank you. My question is for the Honorable Governor General. In our world now, our perceptions towards other people is shaped by the media. So I was just wondering if what is the ICC doing in engaging journalists and the media about they are to be more responsible in their reporting, because the media promotes most of the misconceptions and the stereotypes towards other people. Thank you.
I don't think I would agree with you that the media drives bad perceptions. There's good media and bad media, and I think you need press councils in different countries. We have very interesting ones in our country. There's places for complaints to be made, but certainly what is not, if you say media, I think always, because I was in it, of traditional media, of companies you worked for that produced television programs that you went and turned on a little box and the whole family watched it. Now, everybody has their own source of information. Everybody gets it before the traditional medias actually are able to give you a well thought out documentary that's taken 3 months to prepare, traveling all over the world, getting attitudes, etc. So there's all kinds of things that you could say. Tweeting is not a media. Tweeting, Facebook, Instagram, those are all things that are social media between individuals that do not necessarily have to do with any kind of public communication. You think it's public because 1 million people see it. That isn't public. That is one person going out just saying something and other people willingly or not willingly looking at it or being told by somebody to look at it. There is no sense of the profession of what journals, newspapers, television networks, and that sort of thing are. So I think if you get confused about that, you think, oh, the media is bad, because you think, when I tweet something, people jump up and down on me and say, obscene things to me.
Adrienne, can I just add a couple things? Charlie, you may respond to this, but I know the ICC, just to maybe answer your question more directly, does a number of research reports through our Ideas and Insights platform. One of the ones that RBC sponsored last year was on inclusion. We've done detailed research reports on the economic prosperity that new immigrants bring in. So we take a number of issues, whether it's ballot box, people who vote, whether it's sports, inclusion, economic prosperity, and do very, very detailed, very knowledgeable, thoughtful pieces on that. And through our own media strategy, we, and Charlie and Adrienne and John also write pieces in various journals to try to provide a perspective that's balanced and fair with respect to certain of these issues related to citizenship and inclusion. Now, it may not be enough to counter the effect of certain fake news and otherwise, but I think Charlie and the team actually do a very good job of trying to at least put out there some reasonable fact-based information about how we view and what the benefits are of some of these issues.
Maybe, Adrienne, just time for one more, this young woman across the way, and then we'll be at the end of our first session.
Hi, so my name is Vivian, and I'm from Vancouver, Canada. I'm a Chinese immigrant who also moved to Vancouver, and I'm currently studying at the University of British Columbia. And I have two comments relating to each of the speakers' stories to make, and also relating to some of the comments and questions brought up by our participants today. So the first one is about underemployment for immigrants and newcomers, and that's something that my parents experienced, although as highly trained and educated psychologists, they had a hard time integrating in Vancouver as well as getting jobs, so they have to return back to China. And one thing that I'd like to add in this perspective as a young immigrant, as a millennial, of course, as well, is that I think today it's we also have another barrier, which is, of course, the new industrial revolution, as well as the job market is very difficult nowadays, and that's not only a problem for immigrants as well as locals and just youth of today in general. It's, for example, harder to find jobs for us that can sustain for 10 to 20 years. I think now the turnover is much higher. And I see that as a major problem for today and the work of the future. And the second part of it, it's relating to what the gentleman across the room brought up earlier today on conflict as well as so-called crime in the community brought by immigrants, perhaps. And I think another one of the reasons, and not just underemployment or unemployment, is something that Upkar also brought up. It's this internal conflict. So it's a conflict between integration as well as preserving your identity, because I think from my personal experience as well as my family's experience, that's other than unemployment, is one of the hardest barriers that you have to get through. From many immigrants I talk to, especially from China, everyone goes through a period of like self-hatred, or you don't really know how to deal with your culture, or you don't know if you should 100% try to integrate yourself into the new society or still preserve your own culture. If so, how and in what way? And I think that's something that Canada has been working on in the recent years to try to, not only through representation in cabinet and in other businesses, but through some cultural programs to showcase cultural diversity. But I think there's one saying that I like to share, which I heard from last year, and it was really inspiring, is that instead of thinking about society as a melting pot, which we're so prone to think about, it's a better way to think about it as a salad bowl, where every piece of tomato or lettuce, every piece of society is distinct but all together and in a very nicely tossed way, I guess. Yeah. So yes, that's what.
So maybe great. I'll just a quick comment. Great comments, and certainly share that view with you. And if you go back to Maslow's hierarchy and look at the basic foundation, the food, clothing, shelter, to have the income to be able to support those basic needs before moving up the pyramid to belonging, safety, self-actualization. Ultimately, it is so important. It goes to a couple things. I know that Charlie will tell you we did a report last year on the legal profession called Closed Shops, which is to try to look at certification, how people get recertified in the country to accelerate the progress by which they can actually get jobs in the legal profession. We have more work to do on some of the other professions. And if you go back to some of the comments that Adrienne and Zabeen made about the Syrian refugees, part of the challenge, and actually our ambassador made it as well, part of the challenge is to ensure that when we bring in new immigrants or refugees into the country, we have a system of supporting their success. So we have success stories based on having them supported with linguistic or other social cultural challenges for the fit, but then economic support so that they can in fact learn the language, get a job, and provide for their families, which fundamentally they're all striving to do initially.
I think the identity issue is a really important one that you bring up, because at the core, I think for humanity, our identity is a something that's so key to who we are, where we've come from, and where we're going. And I'm not sure there's enough discourse and conversation around that. For me, when I came to Canada, I desperately wanted to belong, and I thought that meant I had to strip away or bury or hide who I really was. And I can remember the first Christmas after going back to school in January, in pretending that I celebrated Christmas and pretend gifts that I got from people, right? Yeah. Because I was so fearful that if I, and at that time it was, it wasn't what it is today in terms of being Muslim and some of the issues that we see around that, and so it took me about 20 years before I got to a place after I had my kids, and I went to sort of midlife crisis, as I say to people, is probably somewhere in your 30s. It's not really 50. Maybe it will be with the 100-year life, but really going through that reflection. And my children have even more identities because they're half Indian, 1/4 Polish, 1/4 American. So I really sat back and said, who am I really? And what's important to me? And out of that emerged for me this sense and this pride that I was multidimensional. As an individual, you're kind of a salad bowl too, aren't you? Where, yes, I'm a woman, I'm of Indian origin, I was born in Tanzania, I'm a Muslim, but first and foremost, I'm Canadian, and all of those other elements are what make me Canadian. And the freedom and the empowerment that came for me was to be able to sit around boardroom tables and leadership tables and civic organization tables and sometimes think through the lens of whatever a Canadian is, but through the lens of, the majority. Other times think of issues and solutions as a woman. Other times think of it as somebody of Indian heritage. So, how would clients of that heritage actually, how can we approach them? What are the kinds of services they would need? But really getting comfortable that multidimensionality, just as we talk about it at a macro level, is what makes you the best that you can be, because you no longer have to mask or, otherwise it's almost this sense of having to come out multiple times. But once you accept that, it's very powerful. But how do we help people? How do we help people build that pride around the other elements? And I think that sort of inclusion conversation is perhaps where we're at in Canada, and one that I see, a group like you that is actually quite diverse can really play a big role in helping to move to those kinds of conversations.
So I'm going to actually adjourn now for this session. I want to thank everyone for their interventions, Vivian for the concept of the salad bowl. In particular, we're going to take a 15-minute break.
I love it. I'm going to use it.
Meet back in here for 360 at 11:30. Thank you.